Chapter 3, The English Colonies. Section 1, The Southern Colonies. In 1605, a group of English merchants asked King James I, for the right to start a settlement over in North America. King James I allowed them to. This company was called the London Company, and he allowed them to go settle in an area where they called Virginia, which was named after the Queen. So the first colonists to come to America from England come over on April 26, 1607, at a place called Jamestown. Now, the colonists will name it Jamestown after the king. It was the first permanent English settlement. Now, I say first permanent because we talked about in the last chapter Roanoke, but that one mysteriously disappeared. So it was not a permanent settlement. Jamestown will be the first to be a permanent settlement. The colonists were really not prepared for this new settlement. They did not know how to build houses or buildings. They didn't know really how to farm all that much. They didn't have much skill in those things. They didn't have really useful skills in carpentry. Jamestown was surrounded by marshes, which carried mosquitoes, and those mosquitoes carried diseases. And so for that first winter in Jamestown, over 2/3 of the colonists who came over died from either a disease or from famine because they didn't know how to grow crops. If you're looking at the map here, you can see that where Jamestown was in location to Roanoke. And this is a picture of the Jamestown colony right here. You can see it's right on the marshy waters. Jamestown started to do much better when a guy named John Smith, right here, he became the leader of Jamestown in 1608. And he got the colonists to start to work harder and to follow a set of rules. Prior to him becoming the leader, there weren't really some rules in place. So just things were just really kind of chaotic for the Jamestown colony. Once John Smith took over, things became better. He forced the settlers to work hard, and he rewarded people who worked hard, and they were rewarded with food. The colonists were also helped by the powerful Powhatan Confederacy. And essentially how this story goes, John Smith, this guy, met Pocahontas, the daughter of the Powhatan leader, and one day the Jamestown leader, John Smith, was captured by the Powhatans, and they were about ready to kill him. And Pocahontas threw herself over John Smith and said, "Please don't kill him, he's my friend." And so the Powhatan leader said, "Okay, I won't kill him." And they formed this kind of alliance with each other. And the Powhatan will help John Smith and the Jamestown colonists to survive through another winter. The Powhatan also brought them food and also taught them how to grow a crop that grows really well, corn. So in 1609, about 400 more settlers will arrive in Jamestown, but it was still a difficult winter. And this time period was called the starving time because, again, people were struggling with growing food. Even though the Indians had kind of taught them, they still struggled. Jamestown didn't do any better until a guy named John Rolfe will settle in Jamestown, and he will introduce a new type of plant, a new type of tobacco plant to the colonies. And once it started to grow, it became very profitable for the Jamestown settlers. Now, John Rolfe is going to marry Pocahontas. Here's Pocahontas right here. Here's John Rolfe. And the reason why John Rolfe will marry Pocahontas is to form a peaceful relationship with the Powhatans. Now, according to popular Disney movies, Pocahontas here married John Smith or had a relationship with John Smith. That is not true at all. John Rolfe is the one who actually married her. And they actually moved to England at one point, where Pocahontas will see John Smith after a while because John Smith had moved back to England. But she will die over in England. Unfortunately, conflict will begin again between the colonists and the Powhatans in 1622, and this battle or conflict will last for about 20 years. Now, early on in Virginia, the farms were kind of small and they were scattered all over the place. Eventually, when tobacco was introduced, the tobacco farmers started to get more and more land to form these things called plantations. We'll get into that in a minute. The headright system established large farms called plantations, and each colonist who paid their way over to Virginia would get 50 acres of land, and they would also receive another 50 acres of land for each person they brought with them. So let's say they had about 5 kids and a wife. That's, let's do the math. If you have 5 kids and 1 wife, you have 6 times 50 is 300 acres of land, plus the 50 you already had, so that's 350 acres of land. Those are where you get these large plantations. When you have these large plantations, you need workers, and there were not enough workers in Virginia and in Jamestown to work on these farms. So a call went out to people over in England who couldn't come over to Jamestown for, financial reasons. They couldn't afford it. So the people who really own these plantations would pay for people to come over to America for free, or pay for their way over, and they had to agree to work for them for a certain amount of time, usually about 4 to 7 years, to pay off their debt. So again, the plantation owner would pay for someone to come over to America who wanted to, and then that person would have to work for the plantation owner for a period of time to pay off their debt, roughly about 4 to 7 years. Those people were called indentured servants. People who came to America for free by agreeing to work without pay for a set amount of time. So kind of like slaves, but not quite, because they're actually being paid, essentially. The first Africans were brought as slaves in 1619, and once the plantation owners realized that this was a cheap labor source, the indentured servant kind of went by the wayside, and slaves were now being brought in. So the number of slaves grew due to the increased work and the cheap cost it was to buy a slave. As Jamestown began to grow and the economy began to grow, colonial officials began to tax colonists. And this did not sit well with many colonists, especially the poor colonists, and they protested the fact that the taxes were just way too high. They were also upset at the governor and his policies in regards to Native Americans, because Native Americans were constantly attacking the Jamestown colony, and the government didn't really do anything to stop it. So in 1676, a group of people led by a guy named Nathaniel Bacon, who you see right here, who is a farmer, led a rebellion against the governor's policies on taxing and on the protection from Indians. This became known as Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. Nathaniel Bacon's group will essentially burn down the Jamestown colony and the whole process, and he'll go over into native tribes and start killing Native Americans. The guy went nuts. At one point, he will die during the rebellion due to catching a fever, and soon after Nathaniel Bacon died, the rebellion comes to an end. So Virginia was really the first colony Jamestown was really the first colony in Virginia. And you saw how some people just came over to start this colony, just to have a fresh start. Well, there were other groups who felt like they wanted to come to America now because they were looking for some freedom for religion. And there were a lot of Catholics in England. Now, England is a Protestant nation, but there were still a lot of Catholics in the country, and they were feeling persecuted. So a guy named George Calvert, who becomes known as the first Lord Baltimore, asked the king at the time, Charles I, for a charter to start a new colony in America for Catholics. In 1632, Charles is going to issue this charter. George Calvert's son, Cecilius, will take over the planning of the colony, and he becomes the second Lord Baltimore. And he's going to name this new colony Maryland, after the Queen Henrietta Maria. So Maryland was founded as a refuge for English Catholics who were persecuted by Lord Baltimore in 1634. And the Maryland Assembly is going to pass a series of laws called the Toleration Act of 1649 to support religious tolerance, meaning people can come there and practice their religion freely. Now, it's mainly a colony for Catholics, but other religious groups will come there too because of the Tolerance Act or Toleration Act. In 1663, the king, Charles II, is going to give some land between Virginia and the Spanish colony of where we'll eventually call Florida. Okay, so if you see this map right here, we're called the Carolinas, and he gave it to 8 of his supporters. At first, Carolina was a single colony, but then eventually it is separated into North and South in 1712. Most of the people who lived in the northern part of the colony were poor farmers who had moved down from Virginia. In the South, this was mainly the larger plantations, the richer people who, of course, had lots of slaves and lots of land. The last colony we'll talk about today is Georgia. It was founded by a guy named James Oglethorpe as a refuge for debtors in 1733. Now, in England, it was a crime to be in debt, and a lot of times they were in jail. And what James Oglethorpe's goal was to allow these people who had been in trouble for owing money to come to Georgia for a fresh start in 1733. So he originally wanted small farms so that the people who were coming over could handle those and they're not spending a lot of money. He did not want anyone to bring slaves, and he limited land grants. He wanted to make sure that everything was small so that the people who had the land could manage them financially. Unfortunately, the settlers grew a little unhappy with Oglethorpe, and he will be replaced by the king. And then you see the formation of large rice plantations and slaves coming in after Oglethorpe was replaced. The economies of the Southern Colonies. All the economies in the South were dependent on agriculture. You didn't see a lot of business, of course. And the main types of crops that were grown were called cash crops because you make money off them. Examples of these cash crops were tobacco, rice, and indigo. It was a very labor-intensive area when you have cash crops because you're trying to grow as much as you can and cash in on it and make a lot of money. So you needed lots of help in these areas. And the long growing season in the South meant more labor was needed because you're constantly growing. And so that's where slavery will really have a huge influence in the South because that became the main source of labor because it was cheap labor. They weren't being paid. Of course, conditions of slaves were awful. They were brutal. And the Southern colonies were going to pass something called slave codes, and these were laws basically to control slaves. Colonies with large numbers of slaves had the strictest slave codes. For example, South Carolina, slaveholders wouldn't allow slaves to hold meetings or own weapons, and these colonies would not allow their slaveholders to free any of their slaves either. That's the end of Section 1.